right, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, my counterpart, and my colleague at the Sierra Club. Cyrus Reed has served as the Conservation Director at the Sierra Club since 2008. He has a Ph.D. from my alma mater, University of Texas, in geography. He's also served for many years as the chapter's main lobbyist, which is, of course, how I know him at the state legislature. And on a personal note, y'all know we're a multi-issue organization, and I have to do a fairly obnoxious thing at least once a session where I have to call and say, because we track 1,500 bills, and I have to call and get up to speed real quick. And Cyrus is always one of my first calls, and he always graciously takes it and helps me get up to speed. So it is my pleasure to introduce and please welcome Cyrus Reed.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And Sierra Club, we've always participated with Texas Impact in various pre-legislative trainings. Obviously, last legislative session was a little more challenging with COVID, and folks who care about a lot of issues we care about tended not to go to the legislature as much, which made it very difficult given all the attacks on some very key issues. So I have a bunch of slides which I'll go through and have too many words on them, and I'm not going to read every word. And you can, I believe you'll have access to the PowerPoint so you can look at it, in your own time. And if you have questions during the presentation, you can, feel free to interrupt. I mean, maybe I'll start with a question. Who here was impacted by Winter Storm Uri? Okay, that was pretty easy. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll be talking about climate and the Texas grid, but really focused on what happened in Winter Storm Uri, what's happened since, and what does the future look like. And if you can go to the next slide. Just a reminder, a lot of people suffered, which was a bad thing. People died, people were without water, people were without electricity, people with medical conditions really suffered. There was a lot of grace, right? In those moments, there was a lot of people, most of you are church members. I'm sure your churches helped. The church I belong to helped. A lot of people individually in these mutual aid societies, which I didn't know really existed until Winter Storm Uri, where people go online and say, hey, I'm stuck, can someone help me? And people went and helped them. So there was a lot of mercy and grace along with the suffering. So I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it is a reminder that we're all human and we can help one another, love thy neighbor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought there was some good, next slide. I think probably most of you all know this, but 2021 has really reminded us that climate change is real. This is from the NOAA. Can't remember what that stands for, National Oceanic something. But these are all the $1 billion, and this is only through September, so this doesn't include some of the recent fires, et cetera, et cetera. But in 2021, there were many disasters that, and we just had an insurance guy here, that cost more than $1 billion, and 4 of them hit Texas, including Winter Storm Yuri. So, I mean, apocalypse, right? Wildfires, floods, Hurricane Harvey of just a few years ago. We are really seeing more and more climate extremes, and it doesn't mean that every single one of those disasters you can say climate change directly caused that, but I think you can say climate change is leading to more extremes, and the fact that we've changed the environment, and so as we talked about just the last presentation, people are probably living in areas that are prone to flooding or tornadoes. They're together, so the disasters are greater, the costs are greater to society. And again, you can look at this later. So next slide. What I was going to cover today was, kind of what happened with Winter Storm Yuri. Who's to blame? Turns out there are multiple people to blame, as usually is the case. It's more nuanced than you think. A little bit about what ERCOT is, just sort of a 101. What the legislature did in 2021 and didn't do, and what's happening now at PUC, Railroad Commission, ERCOT, and then what happens next and how we can get involved, we the people. There probably hasn't been enough of we the people in this decision making, despite lots of groups, including Texas Impact, Sierra Club, and others trying. More needs to be done. So next slide. So Winter Storm Uri, as it's come to be known, isn't really just Texas. It's really the southeast and going to the southwest. It occurred between February 13th and 17th. Over 170 million, says Americans, probably should say residents, whatever their status, right, were placed under various winter weather alerts. Here in Texas, more than 4.5 million homes and businesses. So that's not people, that's the number of kind of meters impacted. You know, we're without power, some, like in my case, for many, many days. And it was sort of ironic because I sit on the City of Austin Electric Utility Commission, but I really didn't have any idea what was happening or why there was no power in my house. So that, you know, that points to lack of communication, right? Nobody really knew what was going on. There officially, if you look at the state numbers, and I can't remember what state agency is it, DPI? I can't remember what state agency is. They say there was about 250 people that died as a result. All these sort of, if you talk to people at the county level, they all say it was much, much higher. It's just the definition of who was impacted by Winter Storm Uri is being considered in a very narrow sense. So I've seen 700, I've seen more, but obviously a lot more, thousands more were also impacted, you know, people with underlying health conditions, et cetera, et cetera. There were also huge energy bills, and we'll talk a little bit about how those are really going to be put on people's back over time because of some of the decisions the legislature made. And there are huge estimates in the costs to our economy. You know, some say as much as 290 billion. I don't know, you know, it just depends on whose costs you believe, but certainly well over 100 billion and probably much more in terms of the cost, economic cost. So next slide. Man, I put a lot, yeah. So I should get my kids to do my PowerPoints because they do them better. That's a lot of words. There were reports, and this has been confirmed, and I do go to ERCOT meetings. I'm a member of, I go to these meetings. We were within 4 minutes of it being way, 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 way more devastating. In other words, getting to a situation where they would have actually had to restart the whole system. So they say 4.5 minutes, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I can't remember the exact amount. But we were really, really, it was very serious. In fact, if not for some quick action by a lot of people, it could have been much worse. So let's remember that. And then, you know, we have, and we'll talk about ERCOT in a little bit, before some recent decisions that were just made, we had a very deregulated energy market where prices are allowed to rise significantly. And previous to the storm, up until recently, they allow price to go up to $9,000 a megawatt hour. And, you know, a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. 1,000 kilowatts is about what people use in a month. So that's imagine for your monthly bill paying $9,000. The reason they did that is because they wanted to incentivize, you know, an energy only market and investment. And so they allow prices to get to that. When we get in times of scarcity, they allow prices to go that high. What that meant in Winter Storm Uri is prices went that high and yet we couldn't meet the supply. So there were these huge bills stuck on people and companies that had to pay it as well. And there were people, other interests that made lots of money, not necessarily the electric utilities, right? Because they have to, in a sense, they've got to charge you, but they've got to pay that back. They've got to cover their own costs. But a lot of the gas supply companies made billions in profits, which probably isn't, if you believe in justice, probably isn't really just. The people suffered and others made billions. And some of those billionaires gave money to our governor. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there were obviously a lot of problems with water because water systems, it turns out the gas supply and the electric system are connected and water is also connected because you need electricity to run water plants. So when one thing fails, it leads to other things failing. So there were a lot of water woes, and I don't have the statistics there, but there were a lot of you know, water utilities that failed and a lot of people without water. I know at our church and throughout the city, people were distributing water bottles, which in Sierra Club, we don't believe in plastic water bottles, but in this case, thought it was a good idea. And then there were impacts to air pollution, right? Because when industries can't, when they know the power is going to go out and they have to shut off suddenly, those, you know, those sudden shutoffs, startups and shutdowns usually lead to pollution being released, even in the recent freeze, first week of January, when a number of the equipment didn't work at gas wells and gas processing units, and they had to shut off suddenly, a lot of pollution was released because then they've got to, either burn it off, flare it, or put it into valves and let it go because their equipment's not working. So a lot of air pollution impacts. And as is often the case with disasters, it hit everybody, but it tended to hit those who lived in homes that weren't built, to the latest building code, put it that way. The homes that were older, the neighborhoods that were older, neighborhoods that weren't in the new high-rise area. So here in Austin, the folks living on that, I can't remember the name of it, but the big high-rise right east of I-35, a lot of older people with, I've got a gray beard too, I shouldn't say, more experienced people, a lot of more experienced people, more experienced and sexier people, right? A lot, with gray beards. They were living in those apartments. They were impacted. They had to leave because their backup generation didn't work. And they were looking across the highway and seeing downtown Austin lit up, and they were angry, right? So, next slide. Yeah, too many words. Who is to blame? Was it wind and solar's fault? We're relying more and more on wind and solar, and sometimes they don't work at the times you need them. So was it their fault? Was it ERCOT? It's a 5-letter acronym, but for a lot of people it was a 4-letter word. That ERCOT, they were at fault. What about the changing climate? More climate extremes. Was it wise to rely on a non-weatherized, and when I say non-weatherized, I mean not built up to snuff for weather extremes, gas supply? Probably not. Yeah, what about being warned? Exactly. What about being warned in 1983, 89, 2011 by FERC and others? Like, you guys need to weatherize your power supply and your gas supply because the next time it hits, you're going to be impacted, and we didn't do it. Go, sister. What about the demand side? Everyone focused on the supply. What about the demand side? The last gentleman talked about building codes that are good for hurricanes, but those are all good, also good for energy efficiency, using less energy. Why aren't we doing more on the demand side so we don't have to rely on all these power plants in extremes when it gets really hot or when it gets really cold? Yeah, demand going up by 50% in some areas of the state, like South Texas, where they rely on sort of inefficient heating, kind of strip heating. The demand went up like 50% in the residential sector at the very time when we didn't have enough power. So should we be investing in people's homes and businesses to make them more efficient? So next slide. Just a reminder of who's in charge. Texas Legislature is actually in charge, not the federal government. Texas Legislature is in charge of our electric grid because they pass the laws and they oversee the Public Utility Commission. The governor is the person who actually names the people who run the Public Utility Commission. And then the Public Utility Commission is supposed to oversee ERCOT. And they have a board of directors who's supposed to, and there are various committees, and don't worry about all these committee names. There are lots of stakeholders and lots of meetings, but ultimately it's the legislature and the governor who are in charge. And so when people blame ERCOT and ERCOT made some mistakes, just remember there's people that are supposed to be watching that stuff. So that's important to know. Next slide. This is a complicated slide that shows net generator outages, so power plants that were out by the type of fuel. And this is mainly, and I'm sorry, the bottom didn't come out very well, but that's basically February 14th to 19th, that period. And essentially it shows that all of the different types of fuel failed. The one that failed the most was natural gas. Natural gas is the largest part of our electric system, so it makes sense that they had more failures, but it also wouldn't make sense if you were a politician to blame wind and solar if gas and coal were the primary problems. And wind had problems too. A lot of the turbines did freeze. I think it's important that we not say, you know, because I work for Sierra Club, it wasn't wind's fault. Well, it was partially wind's fault, but mainly it was gas and coal's fault, right? So, and solar didn't have much of a problem, but then this was an area, you know, we had a lot of cloud cover, so they weren't really generating a lot anyway. And then next slide. This is basically showing the causes. And so why were these power plants out? Part of it was because a bunch of them decided they needed to go into maintenance. I don't know why they decided, you know, they didn't foresee that we'd have such problems, so they went into maintenance. So they were already out, existing outages. But another big area was fuel limitations. They couldn't get the gas they needed or the coal they needed. So there are limitations. And then there were equipment issues. And I'm not sure what weather related means. I guess it means a combination of everything. This is by the way, I didn't make up these slides. These are from ERCOT. ERCOT did a deep dive after the event. These are from April of 2021. I think they presented this to the legislature. So, and again, if you have questions, feel free to ask them as I go. And then next slide. ERCOT 101, that sort of tan color is ERCOT. Remember, Texas is big. I grew up in New York State, but I've been here 30 years, and I can attest, having driven around the state a lot, I can attest it's a big state. And we are either cursed or blessed by being part of 4 different electric grids. So in the West, if you look at El Paso and Hudspeth counties, that's part of the Western Interconnect. So El Paso Electric is not part of ERCOT. They're outside of it. They did very well, by the way. I mean, relatively well. If you look at that dark brown color, that's the Southwestern Power Pool. So the Panhandle in Northeast Texas is part of Southwestern Power Pool, sort of MISO and all those areas. That's a different electric grid. They had some issues, but not nearly as bad as ERCOT. ERCOT is that tan color, so most of the state. And then that green is CERC, Southeastern Reliability Council, which is where Entergy is. And they also had probably less problems. Not to say there weren't problems, but less problems. And then what's unique about ERCOT is we're the only market, when the legislature decided to deregulate the market, kind of, right? Not fully, but sort of deregulate it. They divided generation, distribution, and retail electric sales, except in certain areas like Austin, which is Austin Energy, which is completely vertically integrated, or CPS. Some of the electric co-ops are not under that deregulated market, but they all participate in it. And what it means is we sell all of our power into the market and we buy all of the power back from the market. So it used to be in the old days, Houston Light and Power was in charge of their area. And so they might, you know, have some contracts with some other folks, but basically they provided the power to their residents. They ran the wires, they sold it, they gave you the bill. Now it's very different. And it means there's maybe less oversight than there used to be, I think is a fair way to say it. And we do socialize our transmission. So our grid is socialized, everybody pays for it. But the risk is really on the power plants, the generators. And so when we say they failed to be ready, they failed to have supply, or they failed to be weatherized, it's because they're running tight margins and they weren't gonna, unless they were told to, they weren't gonna invest that kind of money to make sure they could meet power and climate extremes. It's not worth their time. They're only, you know, there's only a few hours a year when they're making lots of money when the prices go up, and so they're not likely to want to invest unless they're told, unless the legislature tells them to do it. They're not likely to do it, and that's kind of what happened. That's what it says at the bottom. System has a price, largely rewards energy produced at peak. So it's a boom and bust cycle. You know, you make a lot of money a few times a year, and most of the year you're not making much money. So that probably doesn't lead to a very reliable system, at least didn't seem to, especially with climate extremes. Oh, I talk fast. Next slide. That was the next, oh, there we go. So just a reminder, this is hard to see, but the greenish area, probably didn't pick the right colors. This is for 2021. And this is showing you that a large amount of our electricity comes from gas. Actually, it's that light green is the gas. Solar is yellow, which makes sense, which is about 5%. Coal, about 20%. I think it's that dark gray. or that light gray coal, then the darker gray is nuclear, which is about 10%, and then wind is somewhere around 25%. I think I got those right, more or less. So gas is, 40, 45% of the system, and then coal is another 20%. But renewables really has risen, and the next slide will show that. This is a slide showing how ERCOT solar additions are going up and up and up. So solar is really coming on strong, which, as a Sierra Club representative, we like that. It does mean ERCOT has a tough job because they've got to try to balance. They're not in charge of running any of these plants, right? But they have to try to balance demand and supply. And as a lot of our supply becomes intermittent, the solar plants work when the sun is up, the wind plants work when the wind blows. They've got to try to balance all that. And that's not an easy job. What I didn't show is storage is also coming on fast, and storage is going to be very, very important. Any of us who believe in the 100% vision, and I believe it's possible, it's going to take some time, but it's possible, you can't do it without storage, right? We can't just rely on wind and solar. So that's important. So next slide. This is just showing a particular day in ERCOT, just to show that, and I could have showed one in the summertime. This is one in the wintertime. This is the point I was making before, that our loads, particularly residential load, which is the gray, they go way, way up when it gets cold. And a lot of that is because we have, some people rely on gas for heating, but a lot of people rely on kind of strip heating. They don't have the modern heat pumps. And so the demand goes way, way up. And the same happens in the summer, right? We use air conditioning, it goes way, way up in the summer. So again, from our point of view, and I think probably Texas Impact and others agree, we need to spend more time looking at the demand side and investing in where people live and their homes and businesses, because we can't just rely on overbuild a system to supply for these extremes if we could do it a lot cheaper and smartly by investing on the demand side. So next slide. So I'm now to the part where we say, I've told you kind of what happened, Winter Storm Uri, lots of demand, supply issues, climate changing, relying on an energy-only market with very little sort of reliability requirements or weatherization requirements. These are your new folks. These folks should become your friends, or at least they should know who you are. At least they should respect you because you have some sort of power over them. So the four people on the left are the new commissioners. And the one on the bottom right of those four is Peter Lake. I probably should have put their names. He is the new chairman of the PUC. He comes from the Water Development Board. He was, I think he's been there, 6, 8 months? Not long. They basically fired the other guys and gals, and they put these new guys and gals in, mainly white guys, but that's usual, right? Right above Peter Lake is Will McAdams. Who's Will McAdams? He's a nice guy. He worked at the legislature for a long time. He worked for Senator Frazier, for Senator Hancock, I think some other folks, maybe Schwartner for a brief time. He's very conservative. He is very accessible. He comes out of the military. That's Will McAdams. He's another commissioner. On the left, right to his left, is Lori Kobos. She used to be at OPUC, the Office of Public Utility Council. She's a commissioner. And then in the bottom left is, I think his name is James Glotfelty. He comes out of industry. He's worked in New York and other states, and I think Oklahoma. He's helped build gas plants, but he's helped run transmission systems. He's very knowledgeable, actually. These are our four new commissioners. There's supposed to be a fifth. The governor has not named the fifth. But this really came out of Winter Storm Uri. They fired the old folks and put in new folks, right? And they increased from 3 to 5 the number of commissioners, although we have 4 at the moment. The guy in the middle is the new president of the board of ERCOT. They also fired all the ERCOT folks, essentially, and did legislation to say we're going to have 8 new people plus 1 representative from OPUC, and that's going to be the new folks. By the way, I have no idea what time it is or how I'm doing. Am I doing good? Yeah, good. And that guy's name, I want to say his name is Paul Webster. That's from memory. He's from El Paso. He's basically he runs a company that does refining of oil and gas. So he's a business guy. But they've just named the 7 other people plus the new OPUC person. So they just literally this month got in place. For a while, we were sort of operating without a board of ERCOT, or with a minimum board. And then on the right is Brad Jones. Brad Jones is the new ERCOT CEO, and I believe as a CEO, he's also a board member, at least maybe he's non-voting. But Brad Jones is someone who's basically worked for everybody. He's worked for, Luminant or now it's Vistra, but Luminant then. He's worked for a lot of different companies. He's been at ERCOT before. He was in retirement, and they brought him back in part because he's politically well connected. Nice guy, very accessible. He's not going to, buck the governor, put it that way, but he's a reasonable person. You can speak to him. I speak to him. So I email him. He's probably sick of me. Next slide. What the legislature did not do. Was there not a slide that said what the legislature did do? Go to the next slide. Huh. Maybe I forgot to do what they did do. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, what the legislature did do. So, I said this already. They fired the PUC commissioners and ERCOT board. They changed from 3 to 5 commissioners. They changed ERCOT board to non-affiliated Texans. We didn't want any of those out-of-towners running ERCOT because that was part of the blame, right? It was those out-of-towners that caused the problem, even though the governor named the commissioner who oversaw ERCOT. I'm going to blame the out-of-towners, whatever. We required power plants to do more weatherization. So we finally did this. We were told to do it in 84, 89, 2011. After 2021, the legislature agreed, let's make power plants actually weatherize. So that's a good thing, right? And they have to pay for it. So that's a good thing. We required better coordination and communication. That's happening through Texas Emergency Management Commission and a bunch of other agencies. So we're going to have a system kind of like the Amber Alerts, where people actually get communication like, what's happening? What should you do? Go here for more information. So that's good. They created this Texas Energy Reliability Commission. That's part of that work. They created a gas supply mapping exercise, which I think a lot of us that were in this room thought did not go far enough and is going to take too long. But they did that. They required some weatherization and backup power for water systems. They told ERCOT to look at adding some reliability services that we don't currently have, which most people say are, probably a good thing to make the system better. They created an interim committee, which has yet to meet. And interestingly for you guys and for me, they put PUC, OPUC, and ERCOT under sunset review right now, which means, and I think I have a slide on this later. I'll tell you what it means later. And then the other big thing is they securitized all the losses. So all the losses at ERCOT and all the losses from the, like Texas Gas Services and all those folks who had to pay big bills to the folks who made out like bandits. They securitized all that bad debt and loan so they can collect it from you and I over 15 or 20 or 30 years, basically. So without doing any relief to customers or any programs on energy efficiency or any way that would actually help people. I mean, it helps people in the sense that you don't now have to pay your bill of $2,000, right? It can be securitized over time, right? So it helps people a little bit, but what it really does is helps the companies not go bankrupt and keeps the system afloat. So no one listened to me the whole legislative session. What they did not do, they listened to me a little bit. They nodded politely. They require, but enough about me. Let's talk about what the legislature did not do. They did not require robust weatherization of the gas supply. And for those of you, I think a lot of you do spend time at the legislature. Our oil and gas corporations have a lot of political power. They just do. Not just in the Republican Party, also in the Democratic Party. And so they and our elected commissioners at the Railroad Commission spent a lot of time saying, wasn't our fault. The power didn't come to our pump, so we couldn't get the gas to you. Well, it turns out that's part of the truth, but the other part of the truth is their equipment failed and they couldn't get the gas supply, or in some cases, maybe it was withheld purposefully to jack up prices. But in any case, I'd say we did a very weak requirements on weatherization of the gas supply. So what they did is basically say, look at what the critical infrastructure is, like what parts do we really need to get gas to power plants, and at some time in the future require some weatherization, but we're not going to require it immediately. We're going to take our time and look at it. That's basically what they did. We did not make any major changes to building codes. We just talked about building codes. Man, wouldn't it make sense for hurricanes, for fires, for Winter Storm Uri to update our building codes? There may be an administrative process to do some of it. There is, but the legislature could have stepped in and say, let's go to 21 codes across the board going forward. We'll give people a couple of years to implement them, but you know, let's get on board. They didn't do that. They really didn't do anything on energy. They did nothing on energy efficiency, which was the obvious thing. Like, there were 16,000 more megawatts of demand than ERCOT expected on that day. Like 16,000, that's a huge amount. And it was all because we have, you know, homes and businesses that are old and don't meet modern codes or have, you know, crappy heating or systems, et cetera. And we didn't do anything on energy efficiency. And we didn't do anything on climate planning, except in the main bill, SB3, we did put a little provision saying PUC has to consult with the state climatologist, which is a good thing. And so what PUC has done is they said, first round, here are the requirements for weatherization of power plants, but we're going to be consulting with experts, including the state climatologists, and we're going to come up with more robust standards a year from now, which I think was smart. Like, let's get done what we can do right now and then look at it, you know, soon. So this just makes the point I just made, which is there was a new ACEEE report, American Council, help me be, energy efficiency, something like that. Another big, great organization with a long acronym. They put out a report that looked specifically at Texas and found for a fraction of the price of all this weatherization and securitization, all these other things, we could invest in energy efficiency. So that's, you know, obviously something Sierra Club agrees with. Next slide. This is way too complicated. I need to get a PowerPoint. I need to be trained on how to do PowerPoints. Can you help me? Well, I'll just say that's a study again that shows that Texas could save more, has more potential to save electricity, you know, more money we could be saving by investing in energy efficiency demand side than any other state by far. I mean, maybe Florida's close, California's close, but we've got a lot of it, both on the industrial side, commercial and residential. And there's a bunch of words on the left that say that. Next slide. Yeah, they'll have access. So the PUC, how many folks have ever gone to the PUC website, Public Utility Commission of Texas, and looked up a project? Have any? Okay, there's one. There's two. If you're a member of the public, it's hard. I'll just say it, it's hard. Like, if you're not paid to spend your time looking at PUC websites and getting on their, you know, little notice where a new project's been filed, you literally have to go to the PUC website, go up to filings, do a search, and figure it out. But they have opened a project called remember this, this will be on the test, 52373, which is their wholesale market design project. And there has been a dizzying number of meetings and forums and comments due through 52373 on an incredibly fast timeline, like faster than I've ever seen. And why? Well, because Winter Storm Uri was a big deal, but also because they have political pressure. You know, the governor wants to say, I fixed it. So he's telling his commissioners, fix it. And so they have this incredibly, it's sort of, we're sort of in the middle of it, but it's towards the end. You know, they put out strawman questions in October. 5 or 6 days later, all of us had to rush to get answers to their questions. They did these work sessions. And then on December 3rd, they came out with a blueprint for the changes they want to see in our electricity market and related things. And they told stakeholders, give us your responses in 7 days. And then they held a meeting on December 16th, and they made decisions even though they clearly hadn't really read anybody's comments, and I'll get to that in a second. And then they told ERCOT on January 10th, which was a week or so ago, tell us how to implement phase one, like what do you need? And phase two, which is frankly the more controversial part, more expensive to consumers, they said, ERCOT, come back on 15th and basically tell us how to do these things because we really don't know. So it was all very fast, and it's not over. You know, there's going to be rulemakings and lots of comment opportunities. So I hope you guys will all be involved. But next slide. December 16th, we really circled, and I say we in the larger sense, all the sort of progressive groups and groups that work on energy issues, and said if they're going to make a decision on December 16th, and they've never even had a public hearing on this, they've asked for comments, to be fair, but they've never like said, let's have a public hearing on this, invite anybody who wants to make comments. So we organized along with some others, including Texas Campaign for the Environment, and I can't remember if, no, okay, bunch of different organizations, Texas Rising, some of the usual young folks who come to these kind of things, so that's good. I like the young folks. And then Texas Campaign for the Environment had a really good idea, which is we had this petition that about 4,000 people signed, their petition between our petition and their petition, asking for public hearings and for them to put a focus more on demand side. And then they created these icicles and put a bunch of people's names on each icicles. And they went, this has never happened at the Public Utility Commission, I think, like a protest. Not in Texas, happened in lots of other places. So we all marched from the Capitol to here. We held up these icicles on these transmission lines. And then about 25 people spoke to the commissioners, and they were polite, but it didn't influence their decision. They went ahead and said, we're adopting this blueprint, even though it's got lots of holes in it. We don't really know what it does. So they adopted it. But it was still cool to see that people do want to get involved. They do want to have their voice heard. But this is the room. This is the open room for the Public Utility Commission on the, what is it, the 7th floor of the building there on the corner of Congress and 17th Street, whatever, is that Travis building? Yeah, it's a tiny room. It's, as one person said, all I see are you suits around here. It's just energy, you know, people, lobbyists basically, who go. And there's only room for 30 to 50 people. It's not, you would think at a Public Utility Commission, you'd have a big space. And really the only way to speak is to sign up on a piece of paper and said, I want to address the commission. So you can't do it online. You know, it's just not really set up for the public. So we can change that in Sunset. We need to change that. I mean, the Railroad Commission meets in a much bigger room, and well, they're pretty terrible at public participation too, but at least they have a big room, right? At least they have a big room. Yeah, and it has nothing to do with railroad, right? I would have liked to get them under Sunset again, but that wasn't going to happen. Next slide. So they did make some big decisions. They did this PUC Project 52373. If you click on that link, I put in these two long slides, you can actually get to what they voted on. And they adopted some fixes, some of which we agreed with. Like they lowered the maximum price that energy companies can get paid from $9,000 to $5,000 per megawatt hour. That seems like a lot, but we do need some sort of incentive, you know, for people to invest and also for people to turn off their power when prices go high. They did add some emergency response services. So those are things like backup power and demand response. Demand response is when you turn down power when you know, at climate extremes, so you use less power. So they added some emergency response. They're adding some new ancillary services. So those are like reliability services that everyone pays for that are good. They also said, look at some longer term proposals. It's unclear if they actually voted on these things or they just said, we're looking at them because the whole process has been kind of murky. But potentially there might be some big, I'd say costly additions to our market, which would be basically what they call load serving obligations. So the companies that serve load are called load serving entities. They would have to buy extra power basically to cover themselves. And that would ultimately go down to consumers. So it could be costly, and it would tend to favor the largest load serving entities are TXU, which is owned by Vistra, which also owns the power plants, Luminant power plants, right? and NRG, well, it's called Reliant Energy, which is the retail electric provider for NRG. Those are the largest load serving entities in the state. There are some public ones like Austin Energy, CPS Energy, but they're far smaller in terms of the total loads. They have kind of an advantage because they own some power plants. So we're pretty concerned about market power and what that might mean for consumers. But that's one of the proposals. There's a smaller proposal as well, which we'd probably be fine with it, which is more of an energy credit, dispatchable energy credit. And to explain all this would probably take longer than we have. So next slide. Other PUC. That's a lot of money. They did say we want to look at energy efficiency. We do want to look at our rules on energy efficiency. They haven't actually done anything yet, but we thought it was good they had the words like look at these programs in their blueprint. We don't really know what it means, but a lot of our lobbying efforts and hopefully your lobbying efforts is going to be around let's get them to actually have some reasonable goals for utilities to meet on energy efficiency because that could help lots of people along with money from the federal government, the weatherization money, other things, but that would help a lot. They did say we'd like to integrate distributed generation. So like the solar that the last speaker mentioned in his home, how do we get that to be actually part of the energy market? They said we want to look at that. They didn't really do anything specific. At least said let's look at it. So that's good. They haven't really addressed how do we get better data for us. We did spend a lot of money on these smart meters, Smart Meter Texas. It's actually really hard to access that information through your retail electric provider so you could use it in a real-time sense. That would be a good thing to do so people could be more, do more than they can do today. And again, there's been no bill relief in any of these discussions at the legislature or the PUC, even though we know there's lots of people with very high bills. So we're really dependent upon LIHEAP and Weatherization Assistance Program and federal money. We don't, in Texas, Josh knows this, we did away with our System Benefit Fund, right? That was I think a poor deal that Sylvester Turner made, but we did away with a System Benefit Fund. So we really don't have, unless individual companies want to have, we don't really have any required bill assistance in Texas law. Next slide. And I'm getting towards the end, I promise. Railroad Commission had a very weak rule that they approved. And it was, the initial rule was not only weak, it had a huge loophole in it, which was they said, tell us gas supply if you're critical infrastructure. In other words, if you're part of the infrastructure that's needed to get gas to power plants, tell us about it. So we know, so in the future, we can put some requirements on you, some reporting requirements, and eventually some weatherization requirements. And initially they had a loophole that said, you can just pay $150 and say you want to be exempt from that. That even the legislature was upset. As Whitmire said, finally we found something that actually brought Republicans and Democrats together. Like, you can't just do a loophole so you don't have to do anything and pay $150. Now, to be fair, there was some language in the actual bill that passed that said that, but they did improve that rule. But we don't yet know what weatherization is going to look like in the gas supply, and it's not going on right now, so it'll be in the future. Next slide. Here we go. I'm getting towards the end. Sunset. Do people know what sunset is in this room? Some do, some don't. In Texas, we have a pretty unique, I think, good opportunity as members of the public, which is we have an agency called Sunset, and they only exist to look at state agencies and determine whether they're doing a good job or not. And it's a very professional staff. A lot of them are former legislative staff, and they know these issues, or at least have some knowledge of these issues. So we're excited that the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality is going through Sunset. A number of us are involved in that, but we're also excited that one of the good things the legislature did is said, let's put these guys under Sunset this year. So PUC, Office of Public Utility Council, and ERCOT, which is a state agency in the end, it's our independent grid, but it's it's overseen by PUC. This is basically a state agency. They're going through Sunset. The first phase already happened. They all had to do their own self-report, look at my own issues, report it. These are all available on the Sunset website, sunset.texas.gov, probably, something like that. Look it up, B. You can look up their reports, and then we recently met with, oh, is that right? Okay, Texas, yeah. Sunset.texas.gov. You can look at the reports that have been submitted, and then starting in April, the Sunset staff is going to look at these 3 agencies, and that means they're going to be, you know, talking to the agencies, but also meeting with stakeholders. So if you want to meet with them, you just call them and say, I want to meet with you, or talk to B and she can arrange a meeting. I already met with them once. And then they will come out with their recommendations in November, and then there'll be a public hearing in December. And then the legislators, the Sunset Commission members are legislators, and I think 1 or 2 public members. So they will make decisions in January, and then it'll turn into a piece of legislation that'll be called Sunset Legislation for PUC and Sunset Legislation for PUC. This happens every 2 years at the legislature. And we have had victories in the past, like at TCQ. We got a lot of good things out of the last Sunset process. So it's a good, they have to pass the bill to continue the agency, so it can lead to some changes. So next slide. Oh, this is what I just said. Here's the timeline. This is what I just said. Here's the schedule. Oh, last bullet. I didn't even put a bullet. Last many words. We're going to be organizing our own meetings. So there's the official meeting, and we'll send people to that for their 3 minutes of fame. You know how that goes. But we want to hold our own meetings and invite Sunset staff and legislators. So there's already one planned in the Houston area, I want to say in the October timeframe, but we're going to have some other meetings probably over the summer and in the early fall in communities to get input into the changes they'd like to see. So that's important. And some of the, next slide. Ooh, these I told B when I do a presentation, I just write down all my ideas, so it's more like a stream of consciousness. These were, I thought, things we could all be working on together. Public participation. It should be easy to participate in the Public Utility Commission decision-making process. It's not. We should make it easier. Have you gone on the ERCOT website and it's improved compared to how it used to be? It's still really hard to find anything or to understand it. We need to improve the communication. Climate change, I didn't get into this, but ERCOT is still looking back to predict the future. So when they, part of the reason we had problems, right? When they look at what's our load forecast for the future, they're saying what happened the last 14 years, that's what we think is going to happen the next 14 years. That's not what happens with climate change. Extremes become more extreme, so we should be planning for that. So let's make climate change part of that consideration at these agencies. Role of governance of the consumer. At ERCOT, we have one board member, the person from OPUC, that's supposed to care about the consumers, but the others don't necessarily care about that. PUC, we've got 5 commissioners. None of them are necessarily supposed to have a look at the consumer, which ultimately should be their main interest, the consumer. The role of demand side and distributed generation, shouldn't we be incentivizing that more? We think yes. Role of new technologies, all these new technologies like storage, we need to make sure there's a place in the stakeholder community and the process for those to be considered. This isn't the old grid, this is the new grid, so we need to adjust. Enforcement and oversight. PUC also deals with water, so that's a big issue. They do water rates. Budget and resources. Is our energy market actually competitive? Have you looked at all the little companies that Vistra and NRG have bought? Do you know that they now control 75% of the market? Like, that's not a competitive market. If we're going to have a competitive market, let's have a competitive market, but that's not competitive, right? Should PUC be doing more on the gas supply side? Should we release some of the power of the railroad commissioners who are, 80% of their money comes from the companies they're supposed to regulate? Should some of that go to PUC? Should PUC be doing natural gas rate hearings, not the bought for the Gas Company Railroad Commission, right? Should we do that? Some legislators think so. So next slide. And don't forget, and I'm almost done, don't forget Office of Public Utility Counsel. They currently, and you can't read this because it's too small, but they have 13 people currently. I think they can hire up to 20 on their present budget, but they have 13 people and they have some vacancies. And one of them's the head and 4 of them is administrative staff and 1 does budget. So that leaves 7 or 8 people to look at, you know, rates and look at enforcement and look at people's complaints. They're supposed to represent 29 million Texans, not just ERCOT, outside of ERCOT, on electricity and on water, right? And on things like bill relief. That's tiny. I'm sure other states, B can look this up. Other states, the people whose name I don't know can look this up. Other states have much bigger offices. They're the equivalent of office of, they have functioning staffs. We need a better agency that actually represents us, the public. And then I think this is my last slide, the next one. What can we do? Don't forget the federal government. We got the infrastructure bill, and I know it doesn't look great for Build Back Better, but they're talking about breaking it up. There's a lot of money in there for things like fixing up our transmission grid and energy efficiency, and a lot of things that would help. So we should continue to advocate for that with your, I guess it's now just at the Senate, so I don't know what to tell you to do in Texas, but I can provide opportunities, I'm sure you all have too, of how to hook into, you know, calling the key senators. I think we're good in the House, but that's important. We do have an action alert, and I'll say we're about to update this. sc.org, fix the grid. This is where our petition went, which they didn't listen to. We're going to change that petition and really have it focused on energy efficiency. And we are going to be doing some virtual vigils in February to commemorate the folks who died and the people who were hurt, and just remind our political leaders that it hasn't been fixed, that there's still a lot of problems. Get involved in Sunset. And there I put a link to Sunset. SEER, ourselves, Texas Impact, many others are going to be involved in Sunset. I don't think anyone can give you something today to do, but I think by April we'll have things for you to do. So that's important. Local. Talk to your local utility and your local retail electric provider. How are they doing? Do they have programs for energy efficiency? Do they have programs for clean energy? We have a website called TexasCleanEnergyScorecard.com. You can look up the score of your local utility. Not every utility is in there, only the bigger ones, but you know, I can tell you in a nutshell that the way we scored pretty hard, but the 2021 scores aren't great. I think Austin Energy we considered the best at an 80, so a B minus. I think maybe we had 1 retail electric provider who we considered passed, and the distribution companies all failed too. They're just not doing enough. But we can see how they're doing. We can advocate for change at those local utilities. And I have no idea what time it is, but I've spoken a lot. Yeah.
So based on what you said, basically the grid is unimproved, right?
The grid has
We're still
improved.
isolated. We're still isolated.
I didn't even mention that. Another thing the legislature didn't do, they did require a study, but we're still isolated, and we have a few points of interconnection with other grids. They're not, you know, they're not fast. They're DC to AC. I'm not an engineer, but they take time. A lot of people think we should be doing more to integrate with other grids because, one, we could make a lot of money with all that wind and solar when we don't need it. We could be exporting it. But also, when we do have problems, we could import power, right?
So the other thing is too, if we get hit with the same kind of weather situation, we're suspect to have the same kind of problems that we had.
Unfortunately, yes. We have required all the major power plants to be winterized. But remember, in this first phase, we're requiring them to be winterized to the 2011 event. If we have a 21 event, we might be a little bit better, but I think we're still in trouble. It's going to take another year, I think, to get out of that for phase 2 of the rules to be implemented. So yeah, and we haven't done anything about the gas supply. So in the freeze that happened a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 20 to 25% drop in gas supply, bunch of stuff failed, bunch of pollution in the air. So I mean, that's another, if we're going to depend for 45% of our electricity from gas and we don't winterize gas, we're in trouble if we have another event like that.
Question from online. What is strip heating?
Geez, I wish someone who knew what it was. I think it's, does anyone know what strip heating? I think it means, strip heating is like, there's another technical term for it, but it's like not having a centralized system to get heat, like a heat pump or your gas. It's like using little electric heating, electric resistant heating. That's the official name. I say strip heating is electric resistant heating. But it's very inefficient and uses a lot of power, and you should get a real expert to answer that because I'm not an engineer. I just know we could be having programs to invest in modern heating like heat pumps.
On one of your slides a few minutes ago, there was a little teaser at the bottom that you didn't mention that I'm not sure goes with it, but boy, it is a can of worms, and that's broadband. For those who are planning talks in the future, that's a real can of worms.
So, and there's a relation. I think the point I was making is, should OPUC, we don't have any agency that really protects the consumer on broadband as far as I can tell. Should OPUC be doing it? But there is a relation to electricity, because if we are really going to get smart on electricity and like control everything from our iPads and, you know, check in and look at smart meter Texas and see how much energy we're using, you really need to be broadband capable. You need to have access to internet. And if there is a disaster and you want to communicate with people, you know, there needs to be broadband, and we don't have it in a lot of areas.
Hang on.
I have Pedernales Electric, we do where I live, and we only lost electricity for one day. And I have Austin Water, and we were out for 5.5 days. Is the co-op connected to the same grid? I would think so.
It is. Yeah, it is. PEC, I know both Austin Energy and PEC have done post reports that look at all the factors. I've not read the Pedernales. Pedernales is the largest electric co-op in Texas, maybe the largest in the country in terms of just it's a vast, it has those 2 sections. It has the one out by Junction and the one closer to Austin. It's a huge area they cover. And they are vertically integrated, so they're your provider, but they also own the transmission. Although they have their wholesale providers LCRA, so LCRA actually has a lot to do with that as well. But Pedernales also failed though in our scorecard because they haven't done as much as they should on renewables and other things. But they're good on some things.
All right, we have time for one more.
This may be a simplistic question, but when you talk about natural gas, you're talking about the gas that supplies the electric power generators, generating companies. What I'm noticing as you were talking is that at my house, the natural gas was on, even though the electricity was off. What relationship does the gas that powers some things at my house have to do with what you've been talking about?
That's a really good question. In fact, one of the criticisms of the legislation in SB 3, where they say eventually we're only going to winterize the gas that goes to the electric system, is, well, people also depend on the gas for heating. Shouldn't we be winterizing that as well? And the answer is yes. That being said, I have gas heating at our home, and we couldn't get it on because I guess it's integrated in electricity. It didn't work. So, I mean, they're related. You know, I work for Sierra Club, so we want to move away from gas. So a lot of us think that, you know, moving to electric heat pumps is a better choice. but that only is a good choice if we have an electric system that works, right? So it's complicated. That's why I'm saying this stuff is not all, there are shades of gray there. But yeah, it is related. I mean, the same, right? It's the same gas coming from the wells going into distribution line. Some of it goes to a power plant and some of it goes to the local distribution that goes to your home, that's served by the distribution company. And that distribution company is not the gas producer, so they're really just a go-between. So you're going to get hit with higher prices as all the high prices they had to pay when gas went to a tremendous amount of money. They had to pay the gas suppliers. They may not make you pay it back now because they're probably going to securitize it, but your bills are going to go up too. Sorry.
All right, Cyrus, thank you.
Thank you.
That was amazing. Keep this man's name handy.